Chapter 2 Telesburg Palace, City of Telesburg, Kingdom of Old Charis, Charisian Empire. Merlin Athrawes sat silently in his darkened chamber, eyes closed as he contemplated images only he could see. He really ought to have been asleep, taking the nightly downtime Emperor Caleb had mandated, but he'd been following Wallace Macom's group of guerrillas through Owl's snarks for over a 5-day, and the distant AI had been instructed to wake him when the moment came. Now he watched bleakly as the arbalists sent their deadly quarrels hissing into the totally surprised supply convoy. They should have been more cautious, he thought grimly. It's not like both sides haven't had plenty of experience murdering each other by now. But they hadn't been, and now the men struggling to deliver the food their families needed to survive screamed as steel-headed shafts ripped into them. Steaming scarlet stained the snow, voices shouted frantic orders and useless warnings. The men trapped on the trail tried to find some shred of shelter, tried to muster some sort of defense, and another volley of bolts ripped into them from the other side of the narrow valley. They tried desperately to turn the sleds, tried to break back the way they'd come, but a trio of quarrels slammed into the rearmost snow lizard. It collapsed, screaming and snarling and snapping at its wounds, and the trail was too narrow. No one could get past the thrashing, wounded creature, and even as they discovered that, the other jaw of the ambush, the men hidden in the evergreens where the valley floor widened, armed with swords and axes and miners' picks, flung themselves upon the stunned and decimated convoy. It didn't last long. That was the sole mercy. No one was taking prisoners any longer, not in Glacierheart, not on its frontier with Hildermoss. Caring properly for one's own wounded was close enough to impossible under the brutal, broken-backed circumstances. No one had the resources to waste on the enemy's wounded, even if anyone had been willing to spare an enemy's life. But at least Macom's band wasn't as far gone as some of the guerrillas stalking one another through the nightmare which had once been the Republic of Sidormark. They spared no one, but the death they meted out was clean and quick, without the torture and mutilation which had become the norm for all too many on both sides of the bitter hatred which had ripped the Republic apart. Only 3 of the attackers were wounded, just one of them seriously, and they stripped the dead with quick, callous efficiency. The wounded snow lizard was dispatched with a cut throat, and 6 raiders harnessed themselves to the heavy sled. Others shouldered packs taken from the dead men whose naked corpses littered the snow, and then they were gone, slogging off down the trail to the point at which they could break away towards their own heavily guarded mountain fastness. The bodies behind them were already beginning to freeze in the bitter cold. As he watched the attackers hurrying off, Merlin felt unclean as he realized he didn't feel the horror those freezing bodies ought to have evoked in him. He felt bitter, helpless regret as he thought about the women and children who would never see fathers or sons or brothers again, and who would succumb quickly or slowly to malnutrition and the icy cold of the winter mountains. And he felt a blazing anger at the man who was truly responsible for what had happened, not just here in this single mountain valley, but throughout the entire Republic in the months since Jaspar Clinton's Sword of Schuler had been launched at Sidormark's throat. Yet as he gazed down through the snarks at the corpses stiffening in the snow, he could not forget, try as he might, that they were the corpses of temple loyalists, the bodies of men who had reaped the savage harvest of their own sowing. And buried within the rage he felt at the religious fanatics who'd let themselves be used as Clinton's weapon, who'd torched food supplies, burned villages, massacred families on the mere suspicion they might harbor reformist sympathies, was his fury at himself. Caleb and Charlayan might regret all too many of the things they'd been called upon to do to resist the Group of Four's tyranny, but they weren't the ones who touched off the cataclysm of religious war on a planetary scale. No, that had been the doing of Merlin Athrawes, who wasn't even human, who was the cybernetic avatar of the memories of a young woman almost 1,000 years dead. Someone without a single drop of real blood in his veins, immune to the starvation and the cold, claiming so many lives in the Siddarmarkian mountains this terrible winter. And worst of all, it had been the doing of someone who'd known exactly how ugly, how horrible religious warfare, the most dreadful, all-consuming warfare, could be.